For centuries, royal traditions have been a fundamental part of many countries, especially when it comes to the monarchy. A key symbol of these traditions is the royal guards, whose role goes far beyond just standing still and looking impressive in their uniforms. These guards, positioned at palaces, castles, and even royal events, represent the power and discipline of the monarchy. They are the ones who stand sentry, watch over the royal family, and ensure that everything within the palace runs smoothly. Their very presence is a reminder that the monarchy is a symbol of authority, history, and order. The royal guards are known for their stone-faced expression, unyielding stance, and impeccable uniform. They train for years to uphold these standards, and their duties are taken very seriously. Every movement, every step, every glance is measured and controlled. Visitors from all over the world come to witness the guards in action, marveling at how they stand still for hours, without a twitch or even a slight change in their facial expression. The guards are a symbol of discipline, a living testament to the precision and control that has been passed down through generations. It's not just about standing still, though. The royal guards have specific duties they must perform. They are responsible for ensuring the security of the royal family and anyone else who resides within the palace. They are trained in the art of defense, always ready to act if needed. But they are also there to carry out ceremonial duties, whether it's the changing of the guard or participating in grand royal events like parades or state functions. They are more than just soldiers. They are a part of the royal family's identity. They help maintain the illusion of perfection and grandeur that surrounds the monarchy. The whole palace relies on them to create an atmosphere of unwavering control and order. Behind their strict discipline, however, lies a deep sense of pride in their work. To become a royal guard is a great honor, one that requires immense dedication. The selection process is rigorous, and only the most capable are chosen. Training is not for the faint-hearted. Guards must endure long hours of standing still in various weather conditions, enduring extreme heat, cold, or rain. Every single detail is critical, from the way they march to the way they salute. The uniforms, which are often meticulously designed with intricate details, must always be spotless and perfectly tailored. Their shoes must shine, their posture must be straight, and their faces must show no emotion. The slightest mistake, even if it's something as small as a wrinkle in their uniform, can result in consequences. For these guards, there's no room for error. They are expected to remain stoic and unwavering, even in the face of discomfort. It's a challenge that requires physical endurance, mental focus, and emotional control. Guards are taught that their role is not just about carrying out their duties, but also about representing the monarchy itself. The way they carry themselves reflects on the royal family. And that's why they are so respected, not just by the public, but by the monarchy as well. The royal guards, while part of a ceremonial tradition, are deeply integrated into the daily functioning of the palace. Their presence reminds everyone within the walls of the palace about the importance of duty and responsibility. There is something almost magical about their presence, the way they can stand for hours, never speaking, never moving, and yet be so full of purpose. Visitors from all around the world come to watch them, and it's no wonder that many people are fascinated by these figures who seem to be a part of history itself. Life for the guards, though, is not always as glamorous as it might seem. While they are part of something grand, their personal lives can sometimes feel distant and disconnected. Their job is demanding, and it requires a deep commitment. But it also means that they often miss out on simple pleasures, like spending time with their families or enjoying the company of friends. They are bound to the palace, to the routines, and to the ever-watchful eyes of the public. Their lives, in many ways, are not their own. That is why their relationships with the royal family can be so intriguing. To outsiders, the guards are seen as symbols of the monarchy's power, but to the king and queen, they are trusted servants, loyal, dedicated individuals who help maintain the structure and order of the palace. The king and queen rely on the guards to be there, not just to protect them, but to create the sense of calm and control that surrounds the royal household. They are a vital part of the royal life, even if their faces are rarely seen outside the palace grounds. But despite all their training, there is one thing that no guard can control: the unexpected. It's the little moments when the rigid structure of their lives suddenly shifts. Moments when the mask of discipline slips and their humanity shines through. These rare instances, though fleeting, have the power to shift the dynamic in a way that no one could anticipate. And that's what makes the royal guard so fascinating. Behind their perfect control lies the potential for something surprising, something real. As we look closer at these moments, we begin to see that, despite the rigid training and expectations, the guards are more than just statues standing in place. They are people who experience emotions, fatigue, and even moments of levity. They are individuals, not robots. And sometimes, when they least expect it, they reveal a glimpse of their true selves, breaking the perfect character they've worked so hard to maintain. It's in these moments that the connection between the royal guards and the monarchy becomes even more significant. Not just as servants and rulers, but as individuals who, even in their most disciplined moments, can still break free from the confines of their roles. The life of a royal guard is one of duty, tradition, and expectation. Yet, it's also a life that, no matter how controlled, holds room for the unexpected. That unexpectedness is what makes these guards more than just soldiers in uniform. It's what makes them human. The palace, with all its grandeur, is not just a place of royal ceremony. It's a place where even the most disciplined individuals might find themselves, in a brief moment, breaking character. One crisp morning, the air was particularly fresh, signaling the change of seasons. The sky was clear, and the golden rays of the sun bathed the royal gardens in a warm glow. It was a perfect day for the king and queen to enjoy a leisurely walk. The royal couple, always careful to maintain their dignified composure in public, were looking forward to a quiet, peaceful stroll through the expansive grounds of the palace. The palace was bustling with the usual activity: servants tending to their duties, staff preparing for royal events, and the steady presence of the royal guards keeping watch over every corner. The guards, as always, stood tall and motionless, their eyes scanning the surroundings, their posture straight as they stood at their posts with a calm, unwavering focus. The royal family was known for their love of tradition, and days like this were a reminder of the timeless routines that kept the palace functioning. For the guards, it was just another day of their demanding duties, which involved not only standing watch, but also adhering to the strict protocols that came with their positions. Every movement was calculated, every gesture was purposeful. It was a life of precision, one that required them to maintain their focus at all times, no matter the circumstances. On this particular day, however, something felt different. It was a small shift, something barely noticeable to the untrained eye, but it was enough to set the stage for what was to come. The king and queen, walking hand in hand, were making their way toward the gardens, passing by a small group of guards who had been positioned at various points along their route. The atmosphere was calm, almost serene, with the only sounds being the soft crunch of gravel beneath their shoes and the gentle rustling of leaves in the trees. The guards, as always, stood in their exact positions, their eyes focused ahead, their expressions as neutral as ever. But something unexpected was about to happen. As the royal couple approached one particular guard, there was a slight shift in the air. A momentary crack in the guard's stoic expression. A flicker of something human. It was not a grand gesture or a dramatic outburst, but a small, subtle change that was enough to catch the attention of those closest to him. As the queen passed by, she made a playful comment, something lighthearted to break the monotony of their usual interactions. Her voice, soft and pleasant, carried the humor of the moment. The comment was innocent, harmless, but it caused a reaction from the guard, something he could not entirely suppress. For a split second, a brief laugh escaped his lips. It was an almost imperceptible sound, but it was enough to disrupt the guard's otherwise perfectly controlled demeanor. The laughter wasn't loud, nor was it inappropriate, but it was enough to break the strict composure that had been drilled into him for so many years. The guard's reaction was not an intentional one, nor was it something he would have allowed under normal circumstances. But the Queen's warm and friendly approach had caught him off guard, and his smile, though brief, betrayed the emotional wall he had so carefully constructed. The other guards, standing nearby, immediately noticed the lapse in the guard's perfect discipline. A few of them exchanged quick glances, their eyes narrowing in mild concern. They had been trained to be unflinching, to never break character, no matter what. It was part of the royal guard's identity, and a breach in that tradition was something to be taken seriously. The other guards, while not laughing themselves, couldn't help but feel the tension that hung in the air. It was a rare moment when one of their own had shown such a human reaction in the presence of the royal family. It was an unspoken rule that such things should not happen, and yet, here it was. The king and queen, too, noticed the guard's small lapse in composure. The queen, with her usual grace, raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. Her reaction was one of surprise, but not disapproval. The king, always observant but rarely quick to judge, slowed his pace and gave the guard a brief, knowing look. The tension in the air was palpable for a moment, as both the guard and the surrounding royal entourage held their breath, unsure of what would happen next. What was usually a moment of formality had become a rare and unexpected situation. The guard, who had always prided himself on his discipline, immediately realized his mistake. His face flushed slightly, his body tense with the weight of what had just occurred. He had allowed his guard both figuratively and literally to slip, and he knew that he would be the one held accountable. He quickly straightened his posture, his eyes forward once again, trying to regain the composure that he had let slip. His mind raced, thinking about the consequences that might follow. Would this small, fleeting moment of humanity be seen as a failure of duty? Would he be reprimanded for such an insignificant lapse? He couldn't be sure, but he knew that he had just broken one of the most sacred rules of being a royal guard, to never let your emotions show, no matter the circumstances. The royal couple, however, did not respond with the stern disapproval the guard had anticipated. Instead, the queen, with a soft smile, looked over at the guard and gave him a subtle nod, as if to acknowledge his small human moment. The king, too, gave a quiet chuckle, his expression warm and understanding. Their reaction was not what anyone had expected. In fact, it was completely unexpected. Rather than reprimanding the guard or calling attention to his behavior, they seemed to appreciate the rare glimpse into the guard's true nature. It was as if, in that fleeting moment, they had seen the person behind the uniform, the person who had spent years in service and discipline. For the guard, it was both a relief and a surprise. He had always believed that his role was to maintain perfect composure at all costs, but in that moment, the royal couple had shown him that even the most disciplined individuals could afford a moment of vulnerability. It was a small moment, but it held significant weight. The guards around him, though still rigid in their stance, relaxed just a little bit. The pressure that had built up in their chests, the ever-present tension of perfection, seemed to lessen, if only for a brief moment. As the king and queen continued their walk through the gardens, the guard stood silently, his thoughts racing. He realized that, in a strange way, the incident had shifted something within him. It wasn't just about duty and discipline anymore. There was room for something else, something human. The moment passed quickly, and the royal family moved on. But the guard was left with the lingering feeling that perhaps the monarchy, with all its formality and tradition, was not so distant after all. The royal guards were still expected to uphold their duties with the utmost seriousness, But this brief and unexpected exchange had shown him that there was more to his role than simply being a statue of discipline. It had reminded him that, even in the most rigid of traditions, there was room for the small, quiet moments that made life truly meaningful. And as the guard resumed his post, he couldn't help but feel that, just maybe, he was allowed to be more than just a symbol of royal authority. He was allowed to be human. The brief moment of laughter from the guard hung in the air for just a second, but its impact was much greater than anyone could have anticipated. The usual quiet of the palace grounds seemed to shift, and there was a sudden change in the atmosphere. For a brief instant, everything that the royal family and the guards had come to expect from their roles seemed to melt away. It wasn't just the guards' unexpected reaction that had caused a stir. It was the entire situation. The way the carefully maintained routine had been disturbed by something as simple and human as a smile and a laugh. The queen, noticing the small crack in the guard's disciplined demeanor, didn't react with reprimand. Instead, her face softened, and she gave the guard a knowing look, as if she understood what had just happened. There was no judgment in her expression, no stern warning. She simply acknowledged it, in her own way. The king, too, seemed unbothered by the small lapse. His eyes twinkled with amusement, and for a moment, he seemed to appreciate the guard's break in character. The smile on the king's face wasn't one of disapproval, but of recognition. He saw the guard as a person, not just a figure of discipline. And that recognition made all the difference. For the guard, it was as if the world had stopped moving for a brief second. He had always been taught to uphold the highest standards of conduct, to be unmoving and unfeeling. But here, in front of the king and queen, he had allowed a moment of emotion to slip through. It wasn't anger or frustration that had caused the lapse. It wasn't even a moment of weakness. It was simply a human response to the queen's light-hearted comment. And in that moment, it felt like everything he had worked for, everything he had been trained to become, had suddenly come into question. He had expected to feel the sharp sting of correction, the weight of responsibility, as he had been taught all his life. Yet, the response from the royal couple was entirely different from what he had imagined. Instead of being scolded or reprimanded, the king and queen seemed to accept the situation as if it was nothing more than a fleeting moment, something easily overlooked. But for the guard, it felt much more significant. His heart raced in his chest, not out of fear, but from the realization that his mistake hadn't been treated like a mistake at all. In fact, the royals seemed to be acknowledging his humanity rather than scolding him for it. The moment was brief, and soon, the royal family continued their walk through the gardens, leaving the guard standing still once again. But the guard's mind raced. He couldn't help but replay the events in his head, over and over again. Why hadn't they punished him? Why hadn't they followed through with the discipline he had always expected? It wasn't just about the lapse in composure. It was about the royal family's reaction. It was about the fact that, for the first time in his life, the guard had been given permission to be human. For years, he had been taught that his job was to be perfect. His every movement, every gesture, every expression had to be controlled. He had to be a symbol of the monarchy's strength and order. And yet, here he was, standing in the same palace where he had spent years training, with the king and queen smiling at him, almost as if they had just shared a private joke. It was an overwhelming feeling, one that he had never expected. The strict training, the endless hours of practice, the countless rules, all of it seemed to fade away for a brief moment. The guard felt a sense of freedom he had never experienced before, even though it was fleeting. As he stood at attention once again, his thoughts began to shift. He couldn't help but wonder if he had been misinterpreting his role all these years. Was it possible that being a royal guard didn't mean he had to be a statue, an unfeeling figure that existed solely to serve the monarchy without ever expressing anything of his own? The more he thought about it, the more the question seemed to haunt him. Could it be that the king and queen didn't want him to be perfect all the time? Did they understand that he, too, was just a person? His eyes followed the royal family as they walked further into the garden, their laughter echoing faintly in the distance. The sight of the king and queen, smiling and chatting together, made him think of his own life. His days, while filled with duty and purpose, often felt lonely. He had spent so many years standing in place, watching others live their lives, never allowing himself the luxury of feeling anything beyond the rigid expectations of his role. He had trained to be a soldier, to be steadfast and emotionless. But now, in this quiet moment, he was starting to wonder if there was more to life than that. For the first time, he allowed himself to think of the possibilities beyond the walls of the palace. What if he could still serve the royal family with the same dedication and loyalty, but without sacrificing his own humanity? What if he didn't have to be so rigid, so controlled? What if, in his role as a guard, he could still be someone who could laugh, or show warmth, or simply smile when the moment called for it? As the royal family disappeared from view, the guard stood still, contemplating what had just happened. He wasn't sure what the future held, or what the consequences of this small lapse in composure might be. But he knew one thing for certain. He had just been given a glimpse into a different kind of life. A life where perfection wasn't the only measure of success, where humanity wasn't something to hide behind the cold steel of discipline. And for the first time, he began to feel like there was room for both the guard and the man within the same uniform. The other guards, still standing at their posts, were unaware of the internal struggle taking place in the guard's mind. They continued their duties, their faces as impassive as ever, not knowing that a shift had occurred in one of their own. The guard, however, was no longer just the same person he had been moments before. Something inside him had changed. Whether it was a small change or a big one, he couldn't quite say. But one thing was clear. His perception of his role as a royal guard would never be the same again. The rest of the day passed as it always did. The palace returned to its usual rhythm, and the guards resumed their positions. But for one guard, the world had shifted. The strict codes of discipline, while still important, no longer seemed as absolute as they once had. He had been reminded that even in the most disciplined of roles, there was room for moments of humanity, moments that could shape who he was and how he saw his duty. As the sun set over the palace, casting long shadows over the grounds, the guard stood at his post, his mind still swirling with thoughts of the day. It had been a day like no other, a day when the boundaries between the royal guards and the royal family had seemed to blur, and a day when a simple laugh had revealed something deeper about the nature of duty, service, and humanity. The next few days after the incident were strange for the guard. He had returned to his usual duties, standing in his designated post, just like he always did. His movements were still precise, his posture still rigid, but something had shifted within him. The events of that brief moment, the Queen's playful comment, the King's understanding glance, and his own uncharacteristic laugh, kept playing in his mind, over and over again. He couldn't shake the feeling that everything he had been taught about his role as a royal guard had somehow changed. His fellow guards had noticed the difference too. At first, it was subtle. There were no words spoken, but there was a noticeable shift in how they interacted with him. Some gave him the slightest of glances, as if silently acknowledging what had happened. They all knew the rules, the importance of remaining stoic, silent, and unshakable in the face of anything, even if it meant suppressing their own emotions. But they also knew that this guard had broken that rule. And they wondered how the king and queen would react. Would they hold him accountable? Would there be consequences for such a lapse? To everyone's surprise, the reaction from the royal family had been one of warmth, not punishment. The queen's gentle smile and the king's subtle laughter had sent a message that the guard had not anticipated. It was a message of understanding, one that acknowledged the human side of those who served in the royal family's household. But the guard was still unsure of how to process it. He had spent his entire life training to be perfect, to be a model of discipline. How could he reconcile that with the idea that there was room for imperfection, for a moment of laughter and humanity, even in such a prestigious role? The more the guard thought about it, the more he realized that what had happened that day wasn't just a small slip-up. It was something deeper. Something that had the potential to reshape his entire understanding of duty and service. And as the days went on, he began to notice something else. The king and queen's attitude toward their guards seemed to have shifted too. They no longer treated the guards like distant figures who were there solely to serve them. Instead, there was a new sense of connection. A sense that the guards were more than just soldiers standing at attention. They were people too, and they were allowed to show moments of vulnerability. The next time the royal family took a stroll through the gardens, the guard found himself standing at his post once again. But this time, he felt different. His thoughts were no longer entirely focused on his duty and the fear of making a mistake. He was still mindful of his responsibilities, but he also allowed himself to be present in the moment, to enjoy the experience of standing in the palace garden and feeling the warmth of the sun on his face. As the king and queen walked past him, the guard couldn't help but notice the relaxed, comfortable way they moved. There was no tension in their steps, no pressure to appear perfect. They were simply enjoying the day, as any normal couple might. And as they passed by, the queen gave him a small nod, one that was not only a sign of acknowledgement, but also a sign of the newfound understanding between them. It wasn't a formal gesture, but it was enough to make the guard feel something he hadn't felt before, a sense of belonging. It was then that he realized the true meaning of his role as a royal guard. It wasn't about being perfect, about never showing any emotion or breaking character. It was about loyalty, dedication, and the ability to serve with honor. But it was also about being human. It was about recognizing that even in the most disciplined of roles, there was room for warmth, for understanding, and even for a moment of laughter. The king and queen had shown him that, and it had changed everything. In the days that followed, the guard continued to serve with the same level of commitment and professionalism, but he no longer felt the need to suppress his emotions entirely. He still stood tall, his uniform still impeccable, but there was a new sense of freedom in his service. He no longer viewed his position as something that required him to be a robot, devoid of any feeling or personality. Instead, he saw it as a role that allowed him to be himself, to serve with pride and dignity, but also to show kindness and warmth when the situation called for it. One evening, as the royal family gathered for a state dinner, the guard found himself positioned near the entrance, as usual. The atmosphere in the grand hall was filled with the soft murmur of conversation, the clinking of fine china, and the elegant movement of the royal family's guests. The king and queen were at the head of the table, and their laughter could be heard across the room. It was a familiar sound, one that the guard had heard many times before, but this time, it felt different. It was more than just the sound of royalty enjoying a meal. It was the sound of a family, of people who shared a connection and an understanding that went beyond their roles. As the night went on, the guard stood at attention. But his mind was no longer consumed with the usual pressure of maintaining an impeccable stance. He had learned to let go of the constant tension, to accept that his role, while important, was also just a part of something much bigger. He was not just a figure standing in a uniform. He was part of a family that valued not just his duty, but his humanity as well. The king and queen, noticing the change in the atmosphere around them, exchanged a quiet glance. They had seen something different in their guards lately, something they hadn't expected, but something they had come to appreciate. It was a subtle shift, but it was there. The guards, once viewed as distant figures who existed solely to serve, were now seen as people who, despite their rigid training, had the capacity for warmth, for humor, and for connection. And it was this very human quality that made their service even more valuable. The evening passed without incident. But for the guard, It was a night that marked a turning point. He had come to understand that being a royal guard didn't mean he had to shut down his emotions or hide his true self. It meant finding the balance between duty and humanity, between discipline and warmth. The king and queen had shown him that it was possible to be both, and in doing so, they had changed his entire perspective on what it meant to serve. As the night drew to a close and the royal family retired to their chambers, the guard stood in the shadows of the grand hall, his thoughts clear and calm. He no longer felt the weight of perfection on his shoulders. He was proud of his role, proud of his service, but he now understood that his duty wasn't just about standing still or following orders. It was about being a part of something greater than himself, a part of a family that valued him not just as a guard, but as a person. And with that understanding, the guard felt a deep sense of peace. His journey, though filled with discipline and training, had also been a journey of self-discovery. He had learned that, in the end, it was not perfection that mattered most. It was the heart and soul with which he served. And with that knowledge, he stood a little taller, a little prouder, ready to continue his duty, not as a perfect machine, but as a person who knew the true meaning of service. The days following the royal family's walk through the gardens were quieter, but for the guard, they were anything but ordinary. It wasn't just that he had made a small mistake. It was the way everything had unfolded afterward. The king and queen's reaction to his lapse in discipline had changed something in him. He had gone through his training with a sense of duty and seriousness, always striving for perfection. But now, as he walked through the palace halls and stood at his post, he couldn't help but wonder. Had he been wrong all this time? Had he been too focused on maintaining a flawless exterior and not enough on the deeper meaning of his role? The guard's training had always been intense. He had been taught to remain emotionless, to never allow himself to show any weakness or vulnerability. To be a royal guard meant more than just serving the king and queen. It meant becoming a symbol of their power, an unshakable figure standing as a representation of discipline and loyalty. His life had revolved around this idea, but the moment the queen had smiled at him and the king had laughed, it had shaken that perception. The royals weren't just figures to be respected from a distance. They were people, too, with their own personalities and warmth. And in that moment, the guard realized that he could be both loyal and disciplined, yes, but also human. As the days turned into weeks, the guard's perspective began to shift more and more. He found himself still committed to his duties, still standing tall and strong. But there was a quiet ease to his presence now. He no longer felt the constant pressure to be perfect, to live up to an ideal that was impossible to maintain at all times. Instead, he understood that his role was not just about standing still or following orders. It was about being part of something greater than himself, something more than just a uniform and a set of rules. He began to notice the small changes in the way he interacted with the other guards. The walls that had once separated them, the rigid formality, and silence began to crack. He no longer felt the need to hide his true self behind his perfectly trained exterior. When he passed by the other guards, he gave them small nods of acknowledgement, sometimes even offering a brief smile. It wasn't much, but it felt like a breakthrough. They didn't laugh or joke in public, but the guard could see that they, too, were starting to feel a subtle shift in the atmosphere. They were still dedicated to their duties, still as disciplined as ever. But there was a new sense of camaraderie, a quiet understanding that even within the palace walls, they could be human. The king and queen, for their part, seemed to notice the change in the guards as well. They had always been approachable, kind, and understanding, but now there was an added layer of warmth in their interactions. The queen, who had always been the epitome of grace, would sometimes glance at the guards with a small smile, acknowledging their silent service. The king, who was more reserved, would nod in their direction with a quiet but genuine appreciation. There was a mutual respect that had developed between the royal family and the guards, and it wasn't just about duty anymore. It was about recognizing the humanity in each other, understanding that no one, Not even the royals or their protectors could be perfect all the time. One afternoon, as the royal family prepared for a grand event at the palace, the guard found himself reflecting on the changes that had taken place in the past few weeks. He had always thought of himself as just a part of the palace's machinery. An important part, yes, but still just a cog in the wheel. Now, however, he realized that he was more than just a figure in a uniform. He was a person with thoughts, feelings, and emotions, just like everyone else. And the royal family had shown him that it was okay to be human, even in a position that demanded the highest levels of discipline and loyalty. The day of the event arrived, and the palace was filled with guests from all over the world. The guards, as always, stood at their posts, their eyes sharp and their posture perfect. But this time, the guard stood a little taller. He wasn't just performing a duty. He was a part of something. He was part of the royal family's story, part of the history they were creating together. The weight of perfection didn't feel as heavy as it once had. He could still serve, with the same dedication, the same focus. But he no longer had to suppress the emotions that made him who he was. As the king and queen entered the grand hall, they took a moment to look around at the faces of their guests, then at the guards standing in their usual positions. The royal couple exchanged a small glance, a look of mutual understanding, before turning their attention back to the event at hand. The queen's eyes met the guards for just a moment, and she gave him a subtle nod, acknowledging not just his service but the quiet connection that had developed between them. It was a simple gesture, but it meant the world to the guard. He had spent so many years working to earn the respect of the royal family, and now he understood that respect wasn't just about how perfectly he carried out his duties. It was about understanding the humanity that existed within everyone, no matter their role. Later that evening, as the event came to a close, the royal family retired to their private chambers, and the guards began to disperse to their posts. The guard stood still for a moment, his thoughts racing. The path that had brought him here had been long, filled with discipline and sacrifices. But it had also been filled with moments of growth, moments when he had learned to embrace his own humanity. He had started as a young man determined to uphold the highest standards of discipline. But he had become something more than that. He had become someone who understood that true loyalty wasn't about being perfect. It was about showing up, being present, and serving with heart. As he stood there, looking out over the palace grounds, he felt a deep sense of pride. He had not only earned the respect of the royal family, but he had also earned his own respect. He had learned that it was okay to be human, that there was room for kindness, warmth, and even laughter, even within the strictest of traditions. And in that realization, he had found a deeper connection to the monarchy, to the people he served, and to himself. The royal family, in their quiet way, had helped him understand that it was the imperfections that made them all stronger, that the true bond of loyalty wasn't built on perfection but on the shared understanding that everyone, regardless of their position, was part of the same story. And for the first time in his life, the guard felt like he truly belonged, not just as a protector of the monarchy, but as a person who had found his place within the royal family's legacy. The next day, as he resumed his duties, he did so with a quiet sense of confidence. The weight of his role still carried importance, but it no longer felt like a burden. He was part of something greater than himself. And in serving the king and queen, he had come to realize that he was also serving his own journey, one that would continue to evolve, filled with moments of discipline, humanity, and growth. And so, the guard stood tall, as always, his eyes sharp and his posture perfect. But now, behind the uniform, there was a sense of peace. He had found a balance between duty and humanity, and in doing so, he had discovered what it truly meant to serve.